Yes, we are definitely recording. We have all of our past webinars on YouTube, and I can send that link out to you guys, and we will have this one in that same playlist. So all of this will be available to look back on. All right, I think we should get started. Hello, welcome. We're so glad to see you all here today, whatever time of the day it happens to be for you, wherever you are. I believe this is our fourth of this series of Toolkit webinars. I am very excited about this one because I feel like we are filling a need in the industry that's been there for a long time and doing it in a really cool way. And already we're seeing clients jumping on this stuff and using it to make their workflows cleaner and more efficient and more awesome. We're talking today basically about cloud configurations, multi-location workflows. Historically, our pipeline configurations have been ideally used locally. Once we start using them in multi-locations, it gets a little hairy, but we have actually made that workflow, which is so common and becoming more and more common, a first-class citizen in our tools. So we have Manne Ohrstrom, who is our code architect for the Toolkit team and the ecosystem team at Shotgun, who has been sort of dreaming this up and imagining it and implementing it and saving it for a while now. And he is going to talk to us about those things, about cool things you can do with your configs, how we are supporting multi-location workflows, and that's it. So and I'll mention, if you guys have questions, you can put them into the Q&A, and we'll have time towards the end to answer all of those. And that's it. I'll hand it off to Manne.
Awesome. Thank you. And good to see all of you guys here today. Yeah, so this is all about configurations. And actually, so let me get my slides going. I'm going to start, here's the agenda for today. I'm going to start a little bit kind of introducing the cloud configurations by actually looking at our centralized configurations as well, to give a little bit of kind of context, and thereby also covering all the different kind of ways you can configure toolkits, because I think that gives a good grounding. So starting with that, and then we're going to look at the cloud-based configurations, and then we're going to look at a bunch of examples of how advanced distributed configurations can work, and then lastly, briefly touch on disk management, and then hopefully there's plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I'm going to jump right in. So quick recap in terms of toolkit configurations. So this is probably something most of you guys know already, but a toolkit configuration is it consists of a number of different environments. These are YAML files. In each environment we define different engines, Maya, Nuke, etc. Each engine has got apps, and we have multiple environments. And essentially the configuration contains all the settings, and also what we call the location, or the descriptor, which is essentially a pointer to say this is where the actual code comes from. So, for example, a particular version from the Toolkit App Store. So there are sort of pointers or connections to various locations. Could be the App Store, could be Git, could be a path on your disk. And the configuration holds all these connections. And in addition to that, it's got hooks, templates, if you're doing file system stuff, folder schema. And recently we also introduced the core API.yaml, which lets you actually point to which core API a configuration should be using, and that again is a descriptor that points to one of the remote locations you can use. So there are fundamentally two types of configuration. There is a centralized configuration, which is the one that's that Toolkit started with, whereas effectively you have a shared storage that all computers access, and you have a pipeline TD who runs a setup and pushes a configuration in. And then we have the new guy on the block, which is a distributed configuration or cloud configuration. The idea here is that you have a pipeline TD who essentially pushes a configuration to Shotgun, and then any machine that needs to run that particular configuration can just pick it up from Shotgun and run with it from there. So you don't need a central location to manage your configuration. So let me start by looking at centralized configurations to begin with as an intro. So basically, in order to create your project, I think all of you guys probably are familiar with this process. You can use Shotgun Desktop, jump into a project, you then go into your advanced setup, and that will sort of open up the project setup wizard. And here you have a bunch of choices. You can use Git, you can pick up another project's configuration, or you can use one of our defaults from the Toolkit App Store. That gets downloaded. If the configuration has got storages and a disk setup, you define that. And then you also specify where you want the configuration to go on disk, because it's going to be in a known location where everyone can access it. And once you're done with those settings, you then go through. The setup wizard will look at the dependencies of the configuration, all those descriptor locations, and download them from wherever. Usually that's the Toolkit App Store, but it could be other places like Git, and pulls them all down and make sure that you've got everything set up so that you can run that particular project. And then once it's done, you get all of those different options that are defined in the configuration. So that's the very kind of classic way of setting up Toolkit using that wizard. And today is going to be a lot about looking at other ways. So going through this quickly, what is it doing? So you can run this through the wizard, the UI that we just saw, or you can run a tank command, setup project, and effectively you select that config in the UI. It will pull that down, copy it in. It will then, if you have storage requirements, folder schema using templates for your config, you'll set that up, and this will create, populate that field project.tank name in Shotgun, and that will be kind of the root point for your project and where the data is being stored. And then you decide where it's going to go on disk, so the path to the configuration, and then finally it will download all those dependencies, and they will all go into an install folder inside of your project configuration. So you end up with something that looks like this. Where you have your config here. This contains all the bits and pieces. You've got the install folder, which will contain all your different apps, everything that got downloaded. And effectively, you end up with a structure that looks something like this, where for each project you have, your bundle cache or your install folder. You have your configuration, and it's pretty self-contained, which is nice. And you have a tank command, so you can just jump in here. You can run updates. You can do core updates, you can do all sorts of things for kind of admin type stuff. And you can do more advanced things if you want. If you don't want that kind of dependence, if you want them to share some resources, you can have a shared core. This is more of an advanced workflow where all of these projects are sharing the same core and the same bundle cache so that everything gets downloaded into the same location. And development workflows, if you're doing a centralized config, are all around this concept of cloning your configuration. So you go into your pipeline configuration for your project, you will go and run the clone configuration command. You kind of get guided through here. You just type in the configuration. You put in the location on disk where you want your dev area to be. So I'm just going to put it right next to where I have my other setup. And then Toolkit will basically copy everything over for you and set this up. And you end up with this kind of private area. It's restricted to be only your user. And where you can safely kind of perform upgrades, and you can do checks and stuff and safely roll out and update the software. And then later on, you can then push that out to the actual primary config, which is the main thing that all the artists are using. I think this is stuff that a lot of you guys already are pretty familiar with. And then if you look on the disk, you can see now you have a structure where you have your main config here. And then I essentially, using that clone configuration command, I created this new structure where I can do my crazy experimentation and config. And it's OK if I make mistakes in here, or if I do things that break the system, because no one else is affected by that. And using this kind of configuration with source control, it's also possible. So we have a way where you can select a Git repository rather than one of the defaults. And effectively what happens is, as part of the setup wizard, the Git repository is being cloned. So as we're creating that structure on disk, where you have your bundle cache and your core and your configuration, we actually clone the configuration down. And this is great, because we then have a connection to the Git repository. So as we're doing that clone config command in Shotgun on the pipeline configuration, we end up with a dev area which also has a connection to that Git repository. And at this point, you can use branches, you can go and pull down things. You can sort of, these two areas are connected through Git, and this is how you can manage an update going from this side to the other side. So that's the centralized configs in a kind of a nutshell, and this is part of the background and intro to cloud configs as well, in a way. So this is great if you have a good, fast central storage. If you all work in the same location, it's pretty straightforward to manage with tank commands, where you can just sort of run updates and stuff. Where it gets more complicated is if you have distributed artists or remote setups, any kind of decentralized workflow when not everyone has access to the same storage to pull down their data from. Also, if you have really slow central storage, it might be really good for really large files, but it's not ideal for storing small Python files. Some concepts can be tricky and complicated to manage, like shared cores, for example. There's a whole bunch of kind of config and admin that can be required, and you have to do this for every single project. So this sort of takes us up to the topic of today, which is distributed configurations. And essentially the story around this is pretty simple. I mean, around 2 years ago, we asked ourselves the question, hey, we got this pipeline configuration entity in Shotgun. Wouldn't it be great if we could just upload the configuration directly to Shotgun, and then Toolkit could somehow just sort out all the bits it needed on the fly? So that's what we've been busy building for a while now. And it's pretty simple, really, from a kind of a user point of view. Instead of having the setup project wizard creating the pipeline configuration entity for you, it's much more of a manual process where you're driving it, which is great. And before we can upload a configuration, we need to add a custom field in Shotgun that we can actually upload to. So I'm going to go in here and do that. And that's called uploaded config. And it should be a file link field, so we can attach stuff to it. Toolkit will recognize this field and automatically sort of probe for configurations. And I now need a configuration that I can upload to this field so that I can start using it. For my demo here, I'm just going to pick the basic config from our GitHub repo. And if you have a GitHub repo, all you need to do is go into the releases. You can download the source code. It's pretty easy. You got your zip file. It's kind of just pick it up from GitHub, create a new record in Shotgun, new pipeline configuration. We typically name the standard one primary. That's good practice and is kind of understood by the system. And then there is something called a plugin ID, which I will talk about later. We typically set this to basic.star, but we can talk about that more in detail later. And all I need to do is to get that uploaded config field that I just created and pick up my zip file from GitHub and effectively just upload it to Shotgun. So now we've got that configuration with all the different pointers in it that tells you all the pieces that define this particular project in Shotgun. And as I then jump into the Shotgun desktop to that project, desktop will reach out to Shotgun and say, hey, have you got a pipeline configuration for me? And it will say, yeah, sure, it's in Shotgun, and it will download it. It will then look at all of the different dependencies and download them too until it's in a state where it can actually run this project, all happening on the fly. You don't need to run through any of that kind of setup process through the wizard that you need for the centralized configuration. And to go through the different steps very briefly, that sort of going through, because this is effectively what we're doing here is we are kind of setting up the project on the fly on the machine. And it all starts with the Shotgun desktop in this case, and we have kind of what we call a Toolkit plugin that kind of starts everything up. It makes sure the user is authenticated and logs in, so we have access to Shotgun, but we don't really have any other pieces at this point. We don't know what the configuration is. So the first thing that it will do, all automatic under the hood, is it will basically reach out to Shotgun and say, hey, have you got a pipeline configuration for me? It will then download that configuration. And this may be from the Shotgun site itself, like in this case, because we had an uploaded config. It may be from the Toolkit App Store. It may be from Git, depending on how you've configured it. It will then put that into what we call the global bundle cache, which is a big cache folder where we store everything on the local disk. And after that, it's now ready to essentially, on the fly, just set up the project on disk again. So it basically creates a project scaffold in your cache area where you, and then once it's got that, it will then go over and look at all the dependencies for the project and pull them down as well from the App Store typically, or from Git, depending on where you have it, put them all into this global bundle cache. And once it's got that, it's got a full configuration, it will just launch the engine. All of this stuff happens behind the scenes, but that basically makes it possible for anyone to kind of just connect to Shotgun, pick up a configuration, and then just run with it. All of these cache files are stored in a standard location on disk. So if you're on Windows, it will be in appdata Shotgun. If you're on Linux, it will be in home.shotgun. On the Mac, it's in library caches Shotgun in your home directory. And this is something that is configurable. You can move this around to other places if you want. But the idea is that a lot of the setup is kind of happening behind the scenes, as and when you need it. It's all on demand. And it will look something like this. If we look under the hood, that you will have this kind of big bundle cache folder here where everything is cached. So this is shared between all the projects that you're working on. It's trying to be quite sort of efficient about it. And then you have your configuration as well residing here behind the scenes. So you have you have here in your cache location effectively just the full Toolkit project, but it's not something that you need to manually set up. And we have updated all most of our integrations to have effectively this Toolkit plugin that allows for this Bootstrap, this startup behavior. So basically means that you can use all of the integrations with the cloud-based configurations today, and this has been this was released around about a year ago. And there is a full API that wraps around this, which means that you can also write your own integrations to utilize this whole on-demand workflow. And if you're doing development or admin, it's a little bit different. Previously, all you needed to do was to go into your shared storage, you run some tank commands, and things would happen. Now, if we have uploaded the config to Shotgun, there isn't like really any place on disk to go. But actually, it's quite nice. What you can do is, if you say you want to make a change to your configuration, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to check out my basic config from Git, because using source control is great. That means we version everything, we have some good control. So I'm going to show here, checking out a configuration from Git, and then I'm going to set up a dev area in Shotgun where I can actually make some changes and then look at how that can be pushed out to production. So I've got my config here cloned in Git in my temp folder, TMP. And so that's on disk. I've checked that out. I don't use any special Shotgun or Toolkit commands to do that. And now I've got that on disk. That's what I want to do development on, or that's what I want to configure. Now I need to set up my dev area. So I go into my project and I check my pipeline configurations, and I create my new pipeline configuration, call it Manne Dev, and I can set the user restrictions field so that I'm the only one who is accessing this. I'm not gonna be conflicting with anyone else. It's my kind of personal dev place here. Again, I set up that plugin IDs field, and instead of uploading a config this time, I populate the descriptor field. And the descriptor field is a descriptor pointer, just like you have in the configurations. Just rather than having a dictionary form where you have like type, version, name, it's on a string-based form instead, but essentially exactly the same information. So I'm just going to use a dev descriptor here. I'm going to point that to my temp location where I just cloned that GitHub repo. So I'm going to put that tk config basic in there. So now I have a dev location where I can start doing changes and testing some stuff and effectively do updates, roll out new things. So I can go out, exit my project in desktop, click back in, and this will essentially pick up the changes of the configuration. If I go to my dropdown, you can see it's detected my dev area, and it's loading that up. At this point, it's exactly the same configuration. I haven't made any changes. So we're not seeing any different apart from the blue banner that indicates that, hey, you're working on in your dev area now. So it's good to kind of to know that, not to confuse the different worlds. If I go into my configuration and open that up and bring up the environment files, I can now go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and add the Toolkit demo app just as an example. So I can pick that up from GitHub. So I have tk multi-demo, and the latest version that was released is version 1.0.2. So I'm just going to put that in to the config. So I'm just going to add tk multi-demo, add a location, App Store. The name is tk multi-demo, and the version is 1.0.2. And that's it. I save my file and I leave my project and I go in again. If I'm inside of Maya, I can just go reload and it will pick up the changes. And you can see now I've got my demo app running in the configuration, in my dev configuration. So tweaking the config, doing hook development, all of these things are pretty straightforward once you got this up and running. And it's all based on sort of running those manual pipeline configurations and creating them as and when you need them. And I can run my demo app as expected. So that's a very, very kind of quick overview of what the developer workflows looks like when you have a cloud-based config. And here's a quick summary diagram to kind of show some of this, a little bit more of an overview. So you have a pipeline configuration for your project with an uploaded config, and you want to make a change. The workflow here that we recommend means that Shotgun doesn't really know about Git, but it just sort of plugs into whatever you want to use. So you could use this with any source control. It doesn't have to be Git or GitHub. All you need to do is clone and create a dev area of some sort. It doesn't have to be Git. And then once you've done that, you then create a pipeline configuration entry in Shotgun, Dev Sandbox. You can restrict it to your own user. You can invite other people here if you want to. Create that descriptor that basically connects to say, hey, here's actually where my dev area is on disk. And then you're good to go. This will show up on disk. You can make any changes you want to the configuration. It's completely decoupled from the zip file that everyone else is running in production. Once you're ready and have tested it and are happy, you can push your changes back to kind of the main part of the source control, GitHub or any other system. And at that point, you can then start to go through your process, code reviewing, pull requests, tag a version, whatever makes sense, and eventually end up with a zip file that then you can download and you can upload to Shotgun. And the moment that you upload a new attachment here to the uploaded config field, as soon as someone restarts Shotgun Desktop or Maya or any other DCC or any other software, this will be picked up and the new configuration will start to be used. So this is a way to push out a change. Simply by uploading a file to Shotgun, you're effectively distributing a configuration change across all your user base, anyone who's using this. So that's the kind of the very, very this kind of the overview and the basic workflows around cloud configurations. Then we have lots of more advanced scenarios and different variations of this that we can do. We thought it's really nice and elegant that you can upload a config to Shotgun. It sort of makes it really easy to start, but it's sort of, that's only the beginning. There are lots of other ways to run all of these kind of cloud-based distributions. And we've touched on it a little bit. In the dev area example, we were using the descriptor field for the pipeline configuration to point to a dev descriptor. And that's great. You're just saying, hey, I've got some files on disk. I want you to, you know, pick up those files and provide me with that environment. It doesn't have to be just a dev descriptor. Any Toolkit descriptor will work. So it could be something like the App Store or Git. Effectively, at this point, we're creating kind of a pointer to another system where we're saying, when this project starts up, I want you to just pull down this configuration wherever it resides, and use that as part of to be the configuration for that project. And if you're interested to learn more about this, there are multiple different descriptors that are supported by Toolkit. There is API documentation on our developer site, but to go through them very briefly, we have the Toolkit App Store, which is the main kind of distribution hub for the stuff that gets released. A Shotgun descriptor is effectively a pointer to your Shotgun site, so you can have a file attachment in Shotgun on your Shotgun site that gets picked up by a Toolkit configuration. This is what the zip cloud configs are using. That's when you upload that configuration file. But there are other ways to do this as well, which I'll show quickly later on in the advanced section. You then have a connection to Git, both Git tags as well as Git branches. So you can say, hey, I want to pick up a particular tag, or you can say, I want to follow along a particular Git branch, or I want to use a particular Git commit. And what's worth pointing out here is that as soon as you're using a Git descriptor, Toolkit will call out to the Git executable. So that needs to be installed in your system for the Git descriptor to work. And then the rest of the descriptors, path and dev, they are basically accessing a local file system. So they are great if you want to do something and you want to have that code on disk, where the other App Store, Shotgun, and the Git ones are they're just downloading something from a remote place. So there are lots of workflows that you can now unlock once you have access to the pipeline configurations. For example, if you want to lock down a show to use a particular version of, say, the basic config. So if you don't have any pipeline configuration at all in your system, Toolkit will always pick up the latest released version of the TK config basic or the zero config integrations. If you're getting close to delivery or something, and you want to say, well, actually, we don't want to have any updates right now. We're very happy to stay on the version. We don't want any change for this project anymore. We want change for the other projects, but this one is delivering. So you can do this. It's very easy. Just create a pipeline configuration, have a descriptor that points to the App Store that specifies the particular version that you want to lock it down to. Now, anyone who's running this project will get exactly this configuration. The opposite of this is that you want to say, hey, we always want to, whenever we start up Shotgun Desktop or Maya or Houdini or Nuke, we want to grab whatever's the latest thing that's been released. And this is how the integrations work by default. By default, they will always pick up the latest released version of the TK config basic from the App Store. But you can do this as well if you have a studio workflow where you use Git, for example, so you can say, we want to track the latest commit in a branch in Git, or we want to pick up the latest tag that's been created in Git, and that's going to be the workflow that we're sort of following. So that's something that, and basically what you do here is you omit the version number that you normally specify, and that tells Toolkit to pick up the latest one. Another thing that we felt were kind of lacking on the centralized config side is the fact that you had to go through and set up every single project. And what is often the case is that you just want to have one configuration that works for your entire Shotgun site. And then if you have any special needs for a particular project, or you say you want to lock down updates, or you have a special tool chain that needs to be applied, then you want to override that kind of default site behavior. So for the cloud configs, we implemented a series of overrides. So basically, as you are going into a project now with Toolkit, Toolkit will first look for a project config. So this is a pipeline configuration where you have the project field set. And if it finds that, it will use it. If it doesn't find that, it will look for a site config, which is effectively a pipeline configuration where the project field hasn't been set. And if it finds that, it will pick it up. And if it doesn't find that, if there are no pipeline configurations at all, perhaps for your project that you're starting up, it will revert back to the built-in fallback, which for our default integrations are always, as I mentioned before, tk-config basic latest version. So this is what you're getting if you're not configuring anything. And in addition to this kind of set of fallbacks, it will also, of course, look at your dev sandboxes, etc., and you can use those as well. But this is the basic kind of fallback scheme, which makes it really easy to set up a kind of a general pipeline for your studio by creating one of these site configs. So here's an example where there is one, you can see the project field here, where we have one record, pipeline configuration record here, primary, that basically points to a Git repository. It doesn't have a version, so it means it's basically tracking the latest tag that's been created in the Git repository. And then I have a project called Bootstrap, and I've decided that this one should be using version 1.2.3 of the same repository. I'm effectively locking this down. So this is a very simple example of what this can look like in practice. And so a lot of these configuration tweaks are pretty simple to do. It's just a few records in Shotgun that kind of drives the entire pipeline distribution. We've been mentioning a couple of times plugin IDs. So this is kind of an advanced topic, but I want to touch it briefly. So in all of the examples you've seen, there's a plugin IDs field, and we typically recommend putting in basic.star here for the plugin ID. The reason we have this plugin ID is that every integration that we've created has got a particular plugin ID. So the Houdini one happens to be called, the Houdini plugin that runs all of this stuff happens to be called basic.houdini. The Flame one is called basic.flame, and then it's got the version number as well, and etc. And basically, this is a way to tell Toolkit which plugins should I be affecting with this record. And by doing basic.star, it basically says, hey, anything that's got the plugin ID basic.something should be picking this up, which means that you can create more complex filters if you wanted to. You could say, actually, we want to have a config that only is targeting Maya, or is only targeting Flame, for example, by putting in basic.flame.star, for example. So this gives you a lot of kind of fine-grained resolution if you want to push out particular configurations and particular workflows to particular DCCs. And of course, if you're using the Bootstrap API to write your own scripts or services, or say render farm scripts, then you can do the same thing. You create for every, when you're using this Bootstrap API, you effectively define a plugin ID. And we recommend using the basic prefix. That means that it will just work with all the other things that are going on. So this means that you can create workflows where effectively all of the stuff that you are, all the dependencies and all the tools in the pipeline are stored in Shotgun. And meaning that this guy here is the Toolkit App Store, and this is your Shotgun site. So if you have a zip config, for example, upload it to Shotgun, your config will be in Shotgun. and a lot of the other dependencies will be downloaded from the App Store. This is great because your remote users may not have access to your Git repository or a path location that points to a local internal storage on your disk. So how can you distribute something to your remote users if they don't have access to, say, your Git or any of these kind of services? Well, it's actually relatively straightforward. And we've started to see this pattern being picked up by clients. You can effectively create inside of Shotgun a kind of a mini app store. And here's an example that I set up this morning. So I've created a custom entity in Shotgun, and I've started to upload my studio tools that I've created. I have created a payload field here. So a file attachment field similar to what we created on the pipeline configuration, where I upload the actual code that I want to release. I give the app a name, standard naming, TK Maya, Light Rig, TK Houdini, facial setup. And this becomes my kind of app repository that now resides in my own Shotgun site, which means that any user who can access my Shotgun site can also download these things. Now this is great because that means we can start including these in our configs. We can say, oh, okay, I want to distribute the configuration that contains the Maya Light Rig tool. And the way to do this is I created a detail page as well. So that's the payload field. Just want to highlight that, where everything gets uploaded. I created a detail field and where I also created a tab where you can see all the different versions of the code that's been uploaded. And this is done. This is basically this is the file attachment. So I've just created a custom tab where we're looking at all of the file attachments that are associated with this particular item. It's fairly straightforward to set up this kind of query. And what we get here is we can see the attachment ID in Shotgun. And what I can do once I have the attachment ID is I can create a descriptor that I can plug into my configuration, which is of type Shotgun, which means that I can reference this version 790 from my config. And I need to populate a couple of different fields here. Entity type, non-project entity, that's my custom entity that I set up. The name, that's the name of my app, TK Houdini facial setup. Version 790, that's the version of the attachment that I've downloaded or uploaded to Shotgun that I want to use. And the field, that's the custom field I created. So that's that SG payload field that holds these attachments. So this is a little bit of a recipe, but once you've got the recipe set up, it means you can basically grab this, put it into your config, and now you have a Toolkit app that you can distribute to any remote users. If they can access your Shotgun site, it means they can also download this and get this up and running. There are a number of different other patterns that we're starting to explore with this stuff, and we'd love to get some feedback and understand what you guys think this could be used for. There are times when you want to create a very atomic workflow where you want to say, I'm just going to upload one zip file to Shotgun, one of those cloud config zips, and it's going to contain everything. I don't want to go out to the App Store. I don't want to go out to Shotgun. I don't want to go out to Git. This is possible. You can just create a bundle cache folder in your config, and you can effectively kind of pre-populate all the bits, all the different required dependencies, and create a fully self-contained config. And this can be useful if you have a scenario with a kind of air-gapped network or complex proxy setup or various system restrictions. So that's something that we're seeing. Of course, the zip file that you're uploading to Shotgun is going to be a lot bigger, but it sort of makes the number of downloads, etc. It sort of limits that. It makes for a simpler setup. It just downloads that one file and it's good to go. It's possible to combine this with Shotgun permissions. So you can basically say only these users have access to see this particular configuration of this pipeline, which means you can really drive based on shotgun permissions, you can drive your pipeline and who can see what, which is a pretty powerful workflow. We already have a good idea in Toolkit who's authenticated, where, and who who that user is. So effectively, the whole deployment of the pipeline is tied into who you are. I explained earlier on that all of this stuff is cached in particular areas. There are ways to override this. We have an environment variable called shotgun home. There are other environment variables as well, all documented in the dev documentation. But these cache areas can be shared or can be moved around, can be kind of configured to not necessarily use those defaults. And you can build plugins and distributions if you're doing development or if you're running services that can run essentially completely offline. We have something called baked plugins, where all of the dependencies are collected inside and they run completely standalone. So it's possible to effectively take a part of your pipeline and kind of bake it into, say, a Maya plugin and then distribute that. If you have any questions about these really quite advanced options, let us know, because we're very curious to. It's something that we've been using internally quite a lot recently, and we would love to see it being more widely adopted. This is a big, broad topic around workflow and distribution. I recommend checking out the documentation. There's some documentation. The initialization and startup section is a good place, which kind of explains a lot of the stuff I've been talking about here. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on disk space. And I know there are some questions already about disk space, so hopefully this can come up in our discussion too. But what I wanted to point out is that how Shotgun manages templates, folder creation schema, and how we kind of set up the connection between Toolkit configuration and disk space is actually completely decoupled from whether you're using a distributed configuration or if you're using a kind of a more classic central configuration. So what we're looking at here is the basic config. This is the 0 config, the default config that you get if you don't do any setup in Toolkit. And it's effectively missing a couple of files. It's missing the templates file. It doesn't have a folder creation schema. It doesn't have a routes file. And this is because the 0 config, the basic config, doesn't actually use any file system configuration at all. It's all just Toolkit apps that don't write into any kind of predetermined location on disk. Whereas our TK config default 2, which is the kind of default option that you get through the setup wizard, also called defcon2, and we have had a previous webinar about this. It has a full set of templates and schema. And when you're going through the setup wizard, all of this stuff is taken care of you automatically. The setup wizard will make sure that you have a project.tank name created. It will check the routes.yaml file, which defines all the different storages that the configuration needs, and make sure that your shotgun is set up and has those defined. If you are using a cloud configuration and you're basically just creating that pipeline configuration record in Shotgun, there isn't the process you're going through. It's all manual. But this works exactly the same way. The only difference is that if you haven't created, you have to go in and manually basically create the project.tank name for that project. And if you don't do it, you'll get an error message saying, hey, you need to go in and create that project.tank name. But if you want to run a zipped cloud-based distributed configuration using schema and templates, that's absolutely possible. There is no real difference there. The only thing that the setup wizard is doing is kind of trying to make this process smooth and convenient, whereas there is a manual step currently involved if you're doing this by manually creating a pipeline configuration. That's it for today's webinar. I've been talking for about 35 minutes. I hope this has been interesting, and I'm really curious what you guys have in terms of thoughts and questions, and what you guys think this could be useful for.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Manny. That was great. Before we jump into questions, I wanted to do a couple things that I was remiss in doing in the beginning. First is to introduce myself. My name is Sana Sassini. I'm a Toolkit specialist on the street team. And the second is to introduce Rob. Rob Lau is our product manager for Toolkit and the entire, all of this that you're seeing. And he's been answering some questions behind the scenes as you guys have been putting him in. So I just wanted to acknowledge Rob. Okay, I will start with a question that we got a little while ago in anticipation of this, and this is about storage routes for for far-flung locations. It came from KP, and he was asking about specifically, you know, in your templates.yaml file, you can use environment variables to identify facility location, and therefore use different templates for different facilities to manage cases where you know, the storage paths aren't the same in one location as they are in another. But on the schema side, that is not happening. You're not able to do that. It doesn't support environment variables. The root name is hard-coded into project.yaml. So the question here was, do we have any plans to bring the schema side up to speed with the template side to allow different locations to have different storage routes with the same template?
I can grab that one. So we definitely want to grow to be able to manage the actual data files and not just the config, and enable a distributed workflow even out of the box by having some way to route files through Toolkit for distribution. We're scheming. We've got plans for how we're thinking of going about doing that. If folks are interested, hit us up. We can kind of, in one-off meetings, validate some of our thoughts with you to see if we're going in a direction that you like. But yeah, it's something that it's not doable right now, given the way that our schema and the path cache works. It's not a trivial thing to change about Toolkit, and it's actually not Toolkit specific. It's something that we think needs to be addressed shotgun-wide. The local file linking feature is another aspect of how Shotgun treats storage. So we're cooking something up on that front, and it's definitely a problem we're very interested in solving. But that's kind of the state of it. Oh, Tanaz, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Next one came from the Shotgun Dev list yesterday from Fabian. He had a couple of questions. One was, how do you imagine the syncing? So the question of like actual production file syncing, transferring between, say, a remote artist and the studio. And the second one was, is there a good way to balance a simple integration setup for a remote artist, say on their PC, with a full studio setup with templates within your studio?
Yeah, so this brings up a really good point that I probably should have emphasized more in the presentation, is that there are kind of two problems that needs to be solved. One is like, how do you distribute the tools? And then the second one is, how do you distribute the files? And all the stuff I've been talking about today is just about distributing the tools, distributing the pipeline. You're still stuck with a remote artist who's created this beautiful Maya file. It's like, okay, now what do I do with it? It needs to send that to the central storage or send that to the rest of the collective that are working on this project. And the cloud-based pipelines are not kind of solving that aspect. For us, it's been kind of a stepping stone. Now we are starting to think about, what does that look like? What can we do to help with those workflows? We've seen multiple clients using custom entities have done custom setups where they're tracking locations of files. So it's certainly possible with Shotgun, but it's something that would be kind of a manual setup right now. And the actual transfer of the file, where you're sending it using Aspera or an rsync or simply copying it, is also something that, you know, is a tool or a process that you would have to set up by yourself.
Okay.
And the second question, what was that? Having multiple configurations running in parallel. I believe this is possible, and I think, Tanas, we might have had some people who've tried that out already.
Yeah, I've been talking to a client. I don't think he's here today, but what they're doing is like they have their in-house artists, and they don't want to deal with all this uploading and downloading because it just complicates things, and they can have their pipeline configuration stored in a single place locally and everyone can access it. And there's just fewer points of failure in that pipeline. At the same time, they are working with vendors that they want to distribute tools to and share workflows with. So for that case, they're using these uploaded configurations. They're using the basic config, so it doesn't deal at all with file system. And I think that those two workflows are like living in harmony in their studio ecosystem. So yeah, I think you can mix and match and do so happily.
Just to add to that a little bit, using the user restrictions on the pipeline configuration entity, it's perfectly possible to target who uses which config. So you can set it up so that remote users would end up using a config, either our basic config, which would just kind of work out of the box, or if you want to write custom hooks to have the files be uploaded to Shotgun or via some other delivery mechanism that is under your control, you can completely put together a config with those hooks for the vendors or the contractors that you're working with, and hand them a pipeline that you want them to use. And we've seen that used to good effect.
And an interesting kind of variation of that, which is almost like the same thing but inside out, is when you have almost like a client-vendor relationship where you can have a pipeline where one studio or one Shotgun site or one set of Shotgun users need to send stuff to another Shotgun site. And then you can upload one configuration. One person is responsible for uploading two cloud configurations to two sites. And thereby you can easily keep the pipelines, the workflows in sync across sites, which is a really, really tricky problem to solve if you don't have this kind of setup.
Cool. There was a follow-up question from Peter on Fabian's question on the Shotgun dev list. I think we've answered it. Peter, if not, you can jump in on the Q&A and tell us what we're missing. But we do have another question from Peter, actually, from just today, which was, would it be possible to disable the built-in fallback? I think he's referring to when you were talking about the sort of hierarchy of pipeline configurations that it goes through.
That is an excellent question. I think the options are limited today. You could probably do it by creating a kind of an empty configuration and defining that in Shotgun, which would give you no tools. But I think there isn't a simple way to do it. That's a little bit of a roundabout way. That's all I can think of. I don't know if anyone else in the group can think
I was double checking. I didn't feel confident enough to answer that question directly. But we do have the ability to set the fallback paths explicitly on the manager. So I think it depends on how you're initializing things. Via something like the basic config where we're managing it, I don't think there is an easy way, but if you're actually bootstrapping yourself, then I think that there is a way to do that. So I think it depends on your use case there.
That's true. Yeah, if you're writing your own thing that's utilizing the Bootstrap API, then you have complete flexibility. You can do anything. But if you want to say disable the fallback in our default Maya integration, that will require some roundabout solutions at the moment.
Exactly.
Great. There's a question here. Is it possible to use descriptors for Shotgun Desktop itself? I assume that means the actual installable desktop.
Yeah, I started typing up an answer to this, but we're getting close enough to the Q&A that it was easier to just say it. Desktop is interesting in that we try to make it controlled by a config as much as possible, but because it's also kind of an entry point for everything, where you're just double-clicking on an app, there's a portion of desktop that doesn't follow that. So when you install desktop, it's kind of split into two parts. There's actually a host application that will resolve a config and then launch the desktop engine, which is actually the engine itself provides the UI that you're using and all of the functionality. That initial handoff to the engine is controlled by a descriptor. If you take over the site config, then you can completely control which version of the desktop engine is running, tweak it, take over hooks that it provides, all of the usual games that you can play, but it doesn't actually control the version of desktop that's installed on somebody's machine. The version of desktop itself, that host application, you are kind of on your own in order to manage the installer, download that, and distribute it for use. We did recently just make an update to the download page on our support site where you can download that so that you have access to the history of all of the different installers, and they're named after the version of desktop that they are, so that you can kind of manage that a little bit easier. Up till now, we just had access to kind of the current installer, but that's kind of the story of which piece of desktop you can control via descriptors and which you can't.
We've got 3 minutes and 2 more questions. One is from Yi. What is a good way to update all apps in a distributed config, like what tank updates command does?
That's an excellent question. And we do have a developer video that goes through exactly this use case by Rafe. So Thomas, maybe we can distribute that link as well, because it's a really great video and it's got a bunch of overlap with what I've been talking about today. But effectively, you can go in, and even the cloud-based configurations, like your dev sandbox, has got a tank command. It's just a little bit less visible than the one you have in your central setup. So you can go in, find that, and run tank updates, and that should update your dev sandbox, just like you would do with the central setup.
In that video, it also kind of goes over if you're tracking the config in Git, which if you're making these kinds of changes, using some revision control is just definitely a good idea. And then you'd be able to see what update did much easier than looking at the output from update by just doing a diff between the previous version of the file and the results after running update.
Okay, last one. Manny mentioned using shotgun permissions to control access to parts of configs, I believe he says. Is that something we'd have to do on our side? Is there a way to restrict functionality to a specific permission group similar to user? So it sounds like there's 2 questions here. One is, can you use permissions on parts of a config? And 2 is, can you do permission groups the same way that you do specific users?
Yeah, so for the parts of the config, effectively we're leveraging the shotgun permissions model, which means that we can control permissions down to kind of an entity level. And because there's a single pipeline configuration entity that represents a config in the world of Toolkit, that means that the permissions would be on a kind of per config basis only. And as far as the permissions go, I'm not sure what are the options are, and where, Rob, maybe you have more of the insights in terms of how much flexibility we have in the permissions UIs these days. I haven't looked. I know there's been a bunch of changes recently.
Yeah, really, in terms of controlling access to the configs themselves, using the user fields on the project restrictions and the user restrictions field would kind of manage who's using what pieces of which config. If there's sensitive information in the configs themselves, you could put in a support request to have some conditional C permissions added to your site in order to control who could even see the pipeline configuration entity, but you'd have to go through support in order to do that. We've talked a lot about being able to take a config and break it up into pieces so that you can kind of end up running something that's built at runtime by layering together different pieces of a config, but that's definitely kind of more long-term toolkit planning than what's available right now.
Okay, that's all the questions, and we're 1 minute over. Real quick, thank you very much all for coming today. I will follow up with some documents, and Tommy put the link into the chat for Raphael's video, which is awesome. Thank you. And I'll send you guys that link as well. All of that sending will take place on the Shotgun Dev list, which I just posted a link to in the chat. So if you're not on that list, I suggest you get on it. We'll also let you guys know when the recording is available. And that's it. Thanks so much. And we always want to hear from you. Let us know if you have ideas, conversations, issues, whatever. And if you have ideas for new upcoming webinars, we want to hear that too. All right. Thanks very much, all.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Mm.